Welcome back, everyone. We're here with Professor of Economics Randall Wray from Bard College. Professor Wray is also a senior scholar at Levy Economics Institute, and he'll be presenting a lecture on the Green New Deal. So as always, we'll have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. So if you're watching us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, and you've just joined us, you can post your questions on the comments under the live stream, and we'll be able to see them here. And I'll try my best to include as many of them as possible. So I would suggest that you try and keep them brief so that we can include them in the limited time that we have. So without further ado, Professor Wray, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. And as you can see, I have broadened the scope a little bit. I'll explain why. We're in the age of multiple pandemics, and all of these are linked. I don't believe that we can fight these one at a time. We have to tackle all of these, and we need to start right now. So we have COVID-19, and it's becoming more clear that it's going to come back many, many times. We have the pandemics of climate catastrophe, and this is what the Green New Deal is all about. Also, at least in the United States, racism, forever wars. I guess maybe we have ended one of those. We still have others. Forever fires, inequality of various kinds, healthcare, education, housing, wealth, jobs, poverty, unemployment, homelessness is exploding and is going to get a lot worse. Financialization of the economy, secular stagnation, refugees, climate refugees, war refugees, and rising sea levels. So we need to tackle all of these. Fortunately, we have had the return of big government. The total spending that has already been approved and may well get approved within the next year totals about $9 trillion for the United States. I'm not going to go through these, but so far we've had about $5 trillion approved, and President Biden hopes to get another $4 trillion through Congress. When the pandemic first hit, MMT was in the news for the first time in a good way. MMT had been in the news for the past couple of years, but mostly because it was being rejected as crazy talk. In the United States, we actually had 4 resolutions in Congress condemning MMT as a national threat. And sort of ironically, anyone associated with Bard College has been determined to be an enemy of Russia, and we are now banned from going to Russia. Anyway, this all turned around with the pandemic because it was claimed that MMT has found a new way to finance our response: central bank helicopter money. And many people pointed to Japan as an example of a country that's been using MMT. But as we found out, MMT is only for the crisis. It's dangerous. It's inflationary. It's going to lead us on the path to Zimbabwe. So after a few months of so-called stimulus, the attacks on MMT began again. Our argument is that we're in the age of multiple permanent pandemics. The crises are not going to end, so the crisis is not over. It is just beginning. And MMT says there's only one way that modern governments spend: central banks credit bank reserves and banks credit deposits of the recipients. That's a description. It's not a policy recommendation. It's not something you pull out to deal with a crisis. Unlike the 3 COVID relief packages, first with Trump, then with Biden, and also the previous Bush Jr. and Trump tax cuts, Biden and Yellen are now insisting on pay-fors for Biden's Build Back Better plan with a wide variety of tax hikes. And if you're reading the news, you see that we've got some problems with those tax hikes right now in Congress. Anyway, corporate profits tax hike, taxes on high profits corporations, taxes on high earners, high wealth, and hike of capital gains taxes. Janet Yellen said, we do need fiscal space to be able to address emergencies like the one that we've been in with respect to the pandemic. We don't want to use up all of that fiscal space. And over the long run, deficits need to be contained. So to keep our federal finances on a sustainable basis. So I believe we should pay for those historic investments. The same argument was used 13 years ago to justify the meager stimulus that we got after the global financial crisis, only $800 billion spread over 2 years. Our argument is there's no such thing as fiscal space in financial terms. Federal government spending is paid for when the Treasury cuts a check, the Fed credits bank reserves, and banks credit the deposit accounts. The budgetary outcomes are ex post. There's no such thing as deficit spending. We will find out only at the end of the period, accounting period, whether there was a deficit or not. Deficits are not discretionary because they depend on economic performance. I'll provide some data. And they depend on other sectoral balances. Probably most people listening are very familiar with Wynne-Godley's approach. The government deficit equals the domestic private sector surplus plus the net foreign surplus. And so this is not discretionary. We cannot reduce the government's deficit unless one or both of those other balances also change. And finally, the federal government can make all payments as they come due. Its balance is always sustainable. Everyone knows the orthodox views, so I'm going to be very quick. In normal times, we should tax and then spend. Limited borrowing might be okay in recession, but we have to worry about the sustainability condition, which is the growth rate has to exceed the interest rate on government debt. Increasing government spending leads to crowding out. That slows growth and raises the interest rate, which makes it more unlikely that we'll be able to meet that sustainability condition. It burdens our grandkids. They're going to have to pay it back. And so it can result in secular stagnation because the grandkids are trying to repay the debt, so they're not spending. And private investment spending is depressed because of all the crowding out. There is an alternative, money printing, but that's the most dangerous thing there is. Well, we know that occasionally the orthodox economists slip up and tell us the truth. So Paul Samuelson, in this interview, 1974 with Mark Blaug, said, there's a long quote there, I'll just summarize it. Can you keep a secret? The necessity of balancing the budget is that old-time religion. We use that to scare politicians and the population to behave themselves. In other words, we can't trust democratically elected representatives with the knowledge, nor can we trust the voters with the knowledge, so we lie to them. Or Bernanke, when he was quizzed on where all the money came from for the Fed's bailout of the global financial system, he said it's not tax money. We just use the computer to mark up the size of the account. It's just keystrokes. Or Greenspan, when asked whether it was true that the U.S. Social Security program could run out of money. He says, no, it cannot, because we can always print money. There's zero probability of default. So the MMT view has turned this around. We argue that first you spend and then you tax. You can't take out what you have not put into the economy. Taxes are paid by debiting bank reserves. The only sources of reserves are Treasury spending and central bank purchases or lending. The reserves have to be in the system before you can take them out in tax payments or bond sales. So when we go to the magician's show, we all pretend to be surprised when he pulls that rabbit out of the hat. But we know that he's got to put the rabbit in first. We have to put reserve rabbits into the bankers' hats before we can pull them out. Now, most economists, and certainly most heterodox post-Keynesian economists, have learned that injections have to come before leakages. This comes from Keynes. And they're very familiar with Keynes's argument that investment has to occur before we get saving. Investment is the injection, saving is the leakage. But then they get all dazed and confused when we argue that government spending is an injection and it has to come before the taxes can leak out of the economy. But it's precisely the same logic. Injections first, then leakages. Government spending first, then taxes. I like this as an example of given by Farley Grubb, who studied the American colonial currencies. And I won't go through this, but he has studied several of these. The American colonies were the first major use of paper money in the West. The Chinese had been doing it before. And Adam Smith noticed this and mentioned it in his Wealth of Nations, that they would spend paper money into existence. They would impose a new tax that could be paid with the paper money. And when they received the paper money and tax payment, they burned it. So all the tax revenue was burned, not spent. So it's nice and clear. And the other thing that I think has going for it is that these colonies were very weak. They were not issuing an international reserve currency. Okay, and this demonstrates that the taxes drive money is not something that is unique to the issuer of the international reserve currency, the United States, which is a claim that is often made. MMT only applies to the United States. Well, it applied to these tiny little, very weak colonies that preceded the United States that we know. We also like to use the example of Beardsley Rummel, who was a Roosevelt New Dealer, father of income tax withholding. He knew something about taxes. He was also the chairman of the New York Fed. After the war, he went around the country giving a talk. He said, "The war has taught us that taxes are obsolete as a source of revenue." He then went through the purposes of taxes. So this is not to say that we don't need taxes. It's that we don't need taxes as revenue. Taxes do serve useful purposes. The main one is to remove private demand to free up resources for government programs. We can use them to reduce inequality. We can use them to distribute the cost to the beneficiaries of a government program, such as in the United States, we have highway taxes, for example, as a way to distribute costs to truckers. And we can use them to punish bad behavior, or we can give tax breaks for good behavior. And several of these I'm going to be talking about. So let's look at Biden's tax pay-fors to see if they're fit for purpose. To shift resources from private to public use, taxes have to reduce private spending. So how do the progressive tax favorites measure up? How many dollars do you have to tax to reduce spending by $1? One of the favorite taxes of Biden and also progressives in general is the corporate income tax. Well, economists know that it can be shifted. We aren't sure what the incidence is. It can be shifted forward to consumers, backward to workers, and on to shareholders. If you look at the shareholders of American stocks, 40% are foreign, and taxing them doesn't release resources in the United States. 35% are institutions. It's not clear how much that would reduce resource use. That leaves only about 25% are held domestically. They're typically held by high-income people who have low propensities to consume. We look at the millionaire income tax. What's the propensity to spend of millionaires? How much would you have to take away to reduce their spending on resources by $1. The billionaire wealth tax. Elizabeth Warren featured this in her campaign. I went to her website and she made this promise to the billionaires. Look, it's going to be so low, it won't hurt you at all. Well, if it doesn't hurt them at all, it's not going to reduce their spending at all. And that means it's not going to release any resources. And then finally, the high-speed trading tax, what we often call the Tobin tax. How is that going to reduce spending on resources to release resources? So I think none of these really measures up. Instead, a broad-based but progressive tax on consumption or income that is likely to be consumed would be the most effective. To make it more progressive, we can exempt the lowest income levels. When you read the arguments in favor of the pay-fors, you can see that they're all confused. They're conflicting goals. Pay-fors try to match spending with tax revenue. But to control inflation, you want to match the tax to the desired reduction of private spending, not to the public spending. It could be less than program spending, but likely to be much more if it's aimed at high income. And Biden is promising not to tax anyone below a $400,000 income threshold. There's no reason to expect that the ideal level is spending equals tax revenue. It's more likely we're going to need $10 of revenue from high earners to reduce spending by $1, and maybe much more than that. Furthermore, Biden's plan is to have 15 years of taxes to pay for 8 years of spending. How can that be paid for? And why not make it 25 years or 125 years of taxes? Then we could have a very low tax rate. Why withdraw demand for 7 years beyond when the government is going to stop spending? So we're spending for 8 years. Why would we continue to tax people if the real purpose of taxes is to release resources? In fact, we'll be continuing to tax when government spending comes down, when we're in a disinflationary environment. And finally, the tax plan fails to target inequality. Why would a balanced budget increase of taxes coincide with the desired inequality reduction? I would think that we would need much, much greater taxes in order to achieve a desirable level of inequality reduction. So what's the alternative functional approach? Temporary surcharge in the form of a broad-based tax with generous exemptions would reduce resource use as the infrastructure is built. And then we need to boost consumption once the nation's capacity is increased and the government is cutting back on its spending. So, for example, and I'll come back to this, we could ramp up Social Security payments to begin 5 years from now and have a temporary surcharge on the payroll tax, which is a broad-based tax. Then we need high marginal tax rates on income and wealth to reduce inequality. So that is a separate goal. It's not to pay for anything, and it's not to reduce resource use. How high should those rates be? Well, they need to be high enough to hurt. So we can't follow Elizabeth Warren's strategy. Biden's tax hikes raise the average tax rate to about 30% on high earners. Not nearly sufficient. We need a confiscatory marginal rate to reduce inequality. AOC, I think, is on the right track. She advocates a 70% marginal tax rate. Personally, I like 120%. Take it all and send them a bill for the rest. Ideally, we want the marginal rates to be so high that no revenue is raised at all, because you kill that goose that lays the golden egg. We need additional policies to increase income and wealth at the bottom, the job guarantee, and I'm sure that that's going to be discussed further during the conference, with generous wage and benefits, and we need reparations or baby bonds, as Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton have been arguing. So the danger that could lead to inflation is excess spending, not excess money. So it's not flying helicopters that is the danger. It is excessive government spending. Government spending takes one form only. Congress or Parliament authorizes the spending, Treasury cuts the checks, central banks clear them by crediting reserves. Budgetary outcome is known only ex post, as I was saying. As Stephanie Kelton always says, cash registers don't discriminate, so there's nothing special about government spending that makes it inflationary. Too much spending, public or private, can cause inflation. As Keynes argued, true inflation only occurs beyond full employment. We can get what he called semi-inflation before full employment with bottlenecks and pricing power, and we're seeing a little bit of that right now. But it's doubtful that you should use austerity to fight semi-inflation, according to Keynes. And we can, in the United States, our high inflation periods had to do with energy prices, and that's also largely true today. And you don't fight energy crises through austerity. I won't go through the Japanese example. But is it realistic to expect that fighting these pandemics is going to be inflationary? Some people argue that we're already starting to see the inflation in anticipation of Biden's plans. And one thing they've been pointing to is the rising longer-term interest rates that supposedly reflect the market's expectation of high inflation. Our argument against this is that the securities were overpriced massively anyway. They earned just 1% last summer. In other words, the long-term rates were far too low. They're just returning to a more normal interest rate above 2%. Keynes discussed the square rule, and many people now use the notion of duration to argue that longer term rates should be higher. The Fed isn't going to practice zero interest rate policy forever, and expectations have to converge eventually to reality, which is that short-term rates eventually are going to rise above zero. That means asset prices will fall. So it is not a representation of expectations about inflation. It's just an expectation that we can't have near zero interest rates forever. Government debt doesn't need to cause inflation. If we look at the path of U.S. debt to GDP ratio, that has been rising since the global financial crisis, while inflation has been falling really since the early 1980s on a trend path. People worry that the stimulus is going to cause inflation. It's mostly been relief, not stimulus. We were not in a position for stimulus. We were just trying to catch people as they fell down. The evidence shows that they did not run out and start buying up stuff. There have been price increases, but it's not true inflation. It's semi-inflation. Production is starting to recover. Supply chains are recovering. 2 billion low-wage workers are, I think, the main explanation for the downward trend of inflation all over the world. And they will keep wage and price pressures in check. I will quickly go through the sectoral balances. I imagine that this is also being discussed at another time in the conference. For one sector to run a surplus, at least one other must run a deficit. For a country like the United States with a current account deficit, the government deficit equals the private sector's surplus plus the foreign sector surplus. We can't reduce the government's deficit unless either the domestic sector surplus falls or the current account moves towards surplus. The first of those is dangerous when the private sector reduces its surplus and moves into a deficit, as it did during the Clinton years. We have problems with private sector indebtedness, and we have no control over the other account, the current account. That depends on the rest of the world's desire to accumulate dollars, which seems to be insatiable. So we can see that the two do move in the opposite direction. The government sector's large deficits in the last 2 years have been matched by the non-government sector's very large surpluses. This graph shows that deficits go up in every recession. If we go back to the 70s, the government's transfer spending would increase sharply in a recession. Tax revenues would fall in a recession. And we can see that there was sort of an equal contribution of falling tax revenues and rising spending. In recent years, it's mostly been collapsing tax revenue that produces the deficit in a recession. The COVID pandemic is very different because we had these relief packages, so that transfer spending is the main contributor to the budget deficit. You can see the tax revenue has fallen surprisingly little considering how deep the economic impacts of the pandemic were, but in part that is because of the relief packages. Government debt does not push up interest rates, counter to the crowding out theory. Of course, MMT argues that the pressure on overnight rates would actually be down from running deficits because you are increasing bank reserves. And what we see is that as the government debt ratio has gone up, both the overnight rate and the 10-year Treasury rate have been on a downward trend. This makes it clear it's not vigilantes that determine interest rates, it's the central bank. If there's any vigilante in the United States, it is the Fed. And the Fed has made it pretty clear that they are not going to do any more Volckers, and they are even much more cautious than Greenspan was. It's going to take a lot of evidence, I think, of inflation pressures before they're going to raise interest rates, and they're not going to try any shock doctrine on the economy like Volcker did. What about the external constraints? Do debt and deficits threaten the value of the dollar? Sorry, this has got quite a bit going on in the graph. I would just want to highlight the dark purple and the blue. So the dark purple is our current account balance, sign reverse. So as it goes up, our current account deficit is getting bigger. And the dark blue, which is the U.S. treasuries held by the rest of the world. And you see that there's a pretty good correlation until the global financial crisis, when our current account deficit shrank, but the rest of the world didn't reduce their holdings very much. In the conditions of a global crisis, they wanted to hold on to U.S. treasuries as a safe asset. If we look at where treasuries are held, we can see they're held by the major exporting nations, plus the offshore banking centers. That's where U.S. treasuries end up. And finally, we can take as an example bilateral trade with China, and we see that the U.S. balance of trade deficit against China matches very closely the trend matches closely China's holdings of U.S. bonds. So it's pretty clear that for an exporting nation, they receive credits of reserves at the Fed, and they are very happy to trade those for U.S. treasuries in order to earn more interest. Okay, I have a quote here from a guy from financial markets. MMT, in terms of providing insights about the way the world really works, thrashes neoclassical economics hands down. Sovereign government deficits and debt are not scary. Governments spend by issuing their liabilities, currency, reserves, or securities. Taxes create a demand for government liabilities, which are then redeemed through tax payments. Persistent deficits and rising debt are normal, especially for a country with current account deficits. Sovereign government deficits and debt will not create a financial crisis, lead to insolvency or high inflation, or trigger an attack by bond vigilantes. Understanding how government finances work will allow us to reclaim the useful tool of fiscal policy. So the world faces unprecedented and immediate challenges. Human survival is threatened. Coordinated and concerted effort by the richest nations is required. Okay, why should the burden be on them? Because they're the source of most production. So they are in the best situation to try to stand up to these challenges. They've been and will remain the source of most of the environmental destruction. And so it is right that they have to deal with the consequences of this. The age of austerity has to end, and we can learn from the experience of war. When government absorbs 50%, in the case of the United States in World War II, or more of national production. So a few years ago, when Yeva and I started working on the Green New Deal, we looked back at Keynes's little pamphlet, How to Pay for the War, and applied that to the Green New Deal. And we can also apply that to to the multiple pandemics that we face. Keynes said, government has control of the banking and currency system, can always find the cash. So finding the money is not the problem. He says the problem comes afterward. The government's spending remains in the hand of the public, and the government has removed the goods out of the private sector in order to prosecute the war. But they're still providing income to the private sector because they're hiring up the workers to produce the war goods. However, there's nothing on which the proportion of income can be spent. So that's why inflation is the danger. He recommended 3 principles to guide war planning. Use deferred compensation to reward workers. I mentioned that before, I'll come back to it. Tax higher incomes and maintain adequate minimum standards for those with lower incomes. He actually recommended raising their income, even during the war, because they would be making other sacrifices, such as sending family members off to war. So you don't want to put more burdens on them. JFG Foster, an American institutionalist, who was one of the first institutionalists, I think, to fully recognize the implications of Keynes's general theory, had a take very similar to Keynes and using almost the same words. Whatever is technically feasible is financially possible. To the perpetual question, where does the money come from? The answer is clear. It can come from the only 2 institutions we permit to create money funds, the Treasury of the sovereign government and commercial banks. And the rate we permit them to create funds is pretty much a matter of public policy. I want to go back to a couple of examples. In 1921, Henry Ford proposed a major energy infrastructure project in Muscle Shoals, and he wanted the government to fund it by issuing currency. So Thomas Edison was interviewed by the New York Times, and so the question was posed: would not Mr. Ford's suggestion that Muscle Shoals be financed by a currency issue raise some objections? So here's Tom Edison. Certainly, there's a complete set of misleading slogans kept on hand for such outbreaks of common sense. There would be new shrieks of fiat money and paper money and greenbackism and all the rest of it, the same old cries with which the people have been shouted down from the beginning. But maybe they can't shout down American thinkers any longer. The only dynamite that works in this country is the dynamite of a sound idea. And I think we're getting a sound idea of the money question. He goes on to say that the money that's being created to finance the government spending to build Muscle Shoals is going to increase productive capacity. And it's going to pay for itself. He meant in the sense that the customers will be buying the energy from the project. But what I want to point out is, in real terms, the project pays for itself by providing electricity that is increasing the productive capacity of the United States. So there's no need to tax now, because the project is paying for itself in real terms. So resources, not finance, is the true constraint. Tackling multiple pandemics comes down to mobilizing unemployed resources, shifting those already employed, and creating new ones. How do we shift resources from private use to tackling the pandemics? We can use taxes, postpone consumption, patriotic saving, maybe rationing and regulations, which we used in World War II. Spending then will allocate the resources as desired. So once you release them, then the government spends to put them to public use. Taxing releases resources for pursuit of the public purpose. So Yeva and I took that approach to cost out a Green New Deal. Now, we're not interested in the dollar cost, because the sovereign government can always afford this. What we're interested in is costing in terms of resource use. Now, as a first approximation, we had to use the dollar spending that would be required by the program, and the contribution from releasing resources from other uses, also in terms of dollar spending. So just as an example of the way that we were thinking about this, if we implement a job guarantee program that employs about 15 million people and pays $15 an hour, these were the numbers we were using back then, the total spending on the program will be equal to about 2% of GDP. And we assumed that about half of these workers could be used on Green New Deal projects. This is very rough, of course. It's just a preliminary calculation. And that means that the net use of resources for the job guarantee program will be 1% of GDP, because half of the workers in the program are not going to be working on Green New Deal projects, but they will be demanding resources. So that's the thinking. That's why we have a 1% here. The greening projects have been estimated by others to run at the equivalent of about 5% of GDP for 10 years. So that's why we have a 5% there. Medicare for all is actually going to reduce resource use. We used a very conservative number here for the savings of moving to a universal public healthcare system. The US uses almost 20% of GDP for our healthcare system. It's the most inefficient system in the world and by far the most expensive in terms of the share of GDP. So if we look at comparable countries, they spend about half of that. So we could have said that we would save, say, 8 or 9% of GDP, but we're being very conservative. We put it at 3.7. So anyway, you see how we come up with these numbers, and the net increase in resource use would be about 1.3% of GDP to implement a very broad-based Green New Deal program that includes the job guarantee, plus Medicare for all, and plus some other things. Okay. Now, we do not believe that a 1.3% increase resource use is going to lead to inflation that is too high. But to be very safe, if we wanted to err on the side of caution, we could put a payroll tax surcharge on. And so we added a payroll tax surcharge of 2% of payroll, and then our net increase actually would be negative. Okay, so we would have plenty of room there for error, to err on the side of caution and not have any inflation by putting a temporary payroll tax surcharge. And then in return for the payroll tax surcharge, that would only last for the 10 years of the phase-in of the Green New Deal, we would ramp up Social Security payments beginning 5 years in, so that retirees would be getting a substantial increase in their Social Security payments, and all workers from then on would. So that is how we ensure that as the program winds down, we don't get deflationary pressures. So that's the way we would think about doing a response to all these pandemics. Congressman Yarmuth, who is the chair of the House Budget Committee, has really seen the light on MMT. And this is important because the House Budget Committee is an important part of the process of trying to get Biden's plan through. So he did an interview, and I have a few quotes here that I want to quickly go through. He says, historically, what we've always done is said, can we afford to do it? That's not the right question. The right question is, what do American people need us to do? And that question becomes the first question. Once you answer that, then you say, how do you resource that need? Okay, that's precisely the approach that we have been taking. We can afford it because the federal government is not like any household, any business, any state or local government. We issue our own currency, and we can spend enough to meet the needs of the American people. The only constraint, we have to worry about inflation. So he's got the message. Well, basically, we doubled the national debt from the recession in 2009 until last year before the pandemic. And none of the things that people warned would happen happened. We didn't have inflation. We had record low interest rates. The dollar was trading with normal levels. So I think a lot of economists have begun to say, wait a minute, maybe we have been thinking about debt in entirely the wrong way. What we're doing is we're assuming that there will be, this is his strategy now. What we're doing is we're assuming that there will be no bipartisan deal on infrastructure in the Senate. Okay, well, this is almost a sure thing because the Republicans are not going to go along with any of it. So we're proceeding as if all of the American Jobs Plan, all American Families Plan, this is Biden Build Back Bigger, will be in the reconciliation instructions we send to the Senate. In other words, they're going to get around the Republicans with in this process called reconciliation, which allows them possibly to avoid a filibuster And he is pretty optimistic that they actually will be able to get a lot of Biden's package. So let me finish up. In order to pay for multiple pandemics, Green New Deal, the COVID, and everything else, no change of procedures is required. We authorize the spending, and the central bank and treasury already know how to finance it. They already have the procedures that allow them to do it. The ultimate constraint is resources, not finance. The budgetary outcome is neither discretionary nor worrying. Interest rates are determined by central bank policy, not by markets. And inflation can be avoided by policy focusing on mobilizing resources and releasing them as necessary. As I said, the way that we looked at the Green New Deal is a first attempt. In order to implement a major response to all of these pandemics, we need to do more careful planning. We need to do the kind of planning that the United States did for World War II. We have to identify the resources that we need. We have to identify where we're going to get them. How many resources have to be released from other uses? All of those things are very important. Money is not the important matter. So let me conclude with that. Oops.
Thank you very much, Professor Wray. We are now going to go and answer some of the questions that have been sent from the audience. Okay. So the first question is from Stuart Medina. And he asks, what would be a functional and efficient tax policy to ease the transition to sustainable energy? Are CO2 emission markets an efficient tool to speed the energy transition?
I don't think it's sufficient. That doesn't mean I'm opposed to doing them. But that's sort of a market-based solution, and I'm of the opinion that when you have a problem that's been created by the markets, market-based solutions probably aren't the best way to deal with it. I would phase them out, phase out fossil fuels by decree, and I would ramp up alternative energy as fast as we possibly can.
So a follow-up question on that from me would be, I'm assuming that you would be against as well a carbon tax, that you would just simply outlaw or outright limit carbon emissions.
Yes. I think, if we had started back in 1970, when we had a lot of time, it might have made sense to experiment with some of those things. I think that now, when we have about 8 years left, it's too late. I think we have to move very, very quickly, and we need to do this as fast as we can.
Right. Thank you very much. There is another question that just came up just now, and it's related by Whistler Slangent. How do you see postponed consumption work in practice as part of a Green New Deal? For how large share of the GDP capacity can we rely on this tool?
Okay, well, so our rough initial calculations are that the Green New Deal by itself isn't that much of a challenge in terms of resources. So it could be a couple of % of GDP that we're talking about trying to release from general consumption. Now, remember, I just said we're going to phase out fossil fuels really quickly. That will release some resources, but unfortunately, it doesn't release very many. It takes surprisingly few resources to directly produce fossil fuels. So we will release some as we phase out fossil fuels, but we still may need to reduce overall consumption. But it's not a huge amount. How do we postpone consumption? In World War II, what we did was we got the labor unions, the employers, the firms, and the government together and agreed not to have wage increases for the course of the war, with the promise that at the end of the war, there would be benefits to workers. And that worked very well. We kept inflation down. It peaked at 10%, and most of the war is well under 10%. And at the end of the war, workers got health care and pensions. So that's how we postponed consumption. World War II was 50% of GDP. Greening is estimated at 5% of GDP. So the scale is much, much smaller. It won't take much postponed consumption in order to release enough resources for the Green New Deal. Our problem will be matching the resources that we can free up with the resources we need for a Green New Deal. So I think it's a planning problem more than a total resource problem.
Right, thank you. And here's a slightly technical question on the issue of taxation. It says, in today's economies, is tax revenue really destroyed? Or is it not placed in an account which the government can use then to spend on the next budgetary period?
Look, as Keynes said, there is no way to shift financial savings across time. The injections equal leakages at every point in time. So for every accounting period over that period, injections equal the leakages. So we can't save in financial terms for the future. Now, I know that governments keep accounts like this. Social Security is an example. We have a trust fund, which has accumulated a huge amount of government bonds since the 1980s, when we changed Social Security from essentially a pay-as-you-go to what's called advanced funding. That means that the revenues were much greater than the spending. So the idea was that we will save for the future when baby boomers start to retire. But think about it. What this means is that one hand of the government owes the other hand of the government. Okay, that's what the trust fund is. It's U.S. Treasuries. So it's the U.S. Treasury owing the U.S. Treasury. There's nothing there. When we total the spending at the end of the year, the government will be engaging, issuing bonds in an amount equal to whatever that shortfall in Social Security turns out to be. Okay. Well, Keynes argued that actually when you do this, you're trying to set aside funds to spend later, you are depressing demand in all of those years that you have been trying to run surpluses in the budget. So you have been suffering from lower demand for all those years since 1980, the early 80s, when we raised the tax rates in Social Security. And depressing demand is not a good way to prepare for retiring baby boomers in the 2020s, because it means all of that period you had depressed demand, which depresses the incentive to invest, which means you're not getting the private infrastructure that you'll need to take care of retiring baby boomers. And also, the government wasn't spending because it's trying to run a surplus in order to save for the retirees, which means we also don't have the public infrastructure that we need. And both of those things are true, by the way, in the United States. We are not prepared for retiring baby boomers because we have been running with aggregate demand that was too low all along. So I know that this seems counterintuitive, because saving is good for individuals, and you should save for your own individual retirement. And you can do that by accumulating claims on others, including claims on the government. So it's perfectly fine for individuals to do that, and so this is one of those fallacies of composition and paradox of thrift that Keynes warns about. It's not possible for society to save in anything except real terms, that is, real productive equipment, capital and bridges and things like that.
Right. Thank you very much for that. And then there's a question for Tom Olin, and I guess it's related to the to the fact politicians are finally speaking out in favor of MMT. And I think there is discussion that he cannot be alone. A lot of politicians around him need to also know MMT in order for this person to feel confident enough to talk about it. So Tom Olin asks, to what extent do politicians resist MMT in order to defend their reputations or maybe conceal their own ignorance with regards to the economy?
Yeah. So I think a few hours ago, a lot of you probably heard Warren Mosler. So we've been at this 25 years, a little bit more, I guess. And over the years, we met with politicians or their economic advisors. And I can tell you many times when we're with them in private, they say, we understand what you're saying. Okay, we know the federal government can't run out of money. They understand that. But I cannot say that in public. So that was a problem back then. And it remains a big problem today. So that's definitely true. So is Yarmouth surrounded by others who think like he does? I think that there are others. And so Yarmouth invited me to testify before the House Budget Committee. And he told me that the other Democrats on the committee understood this, okay? And I think that what the questioner posited is true. That is why he feels more comfortable saying this in public, because the number of people who understand this and are talking about it behind closed doors has been increasing. I think it's partly the persistence of MMT followers, bloggers, and having Stephanie Kelton working with Bernie Sanders, and it's partly the realization of the challenges that we face, so spending so much on the COVID response, and as Yarmouth says, none of the predictions about the disasters that would come if we did that happened. And so I think it's also the looking at the real world around them that also is helping. So yes, I think that there are a significant number of people in Congress who understand this, and hopefully more of them will feel that they can speak in public. I guess I'm not a political scientist, and I don't follow politics and voting in districts closely at all. But I guess Yarmouth is in a pretty safe position and not too worried about upcoming elections. Many Democrats are not in that position. That makes it very hard for them to say these things in public.
Perfect. And Daniel Haim is asking, so what are the chances that any form of a job guarantee will be introduced by the current US government, for example, such as a modern civilian conservation corps program?
Yeah, and I think that's probably the one. I think you've identified it. I would say a pretty good chance of that. Modern CCC. It's going to be, environmental. It will be part of the environmental response, part of the Green New Deal response. A universal job guarantee like MMT advocates, maybe we're not too close to that one. But I think a limited one, yes, we will see it.
Yeah, great. And now one from me actually, which it's been going on in the UK for a while, that some economists, particularly on the left, actually talking about inequality being driven by interest rates and low interest rates through incrementing of asset prices. What would you say to this? Is there any truth to that? And would raising interest rates fix that?
I don't think raising interest rates is going to fix it. There could be some truth to it. I'm a little skeptical, but I'm open to the argument that low interest rates are boosting asset prices. But I don't think raising interest rates is the right solution. I think the right solution is to tackle the completely out of control financial system and to try to rein it in. I think that's the better response, and tackle inequality directly. Let's go after high income, high wealth, tax evaders, tax avoiders, and out of control compensation for CEOs of public corporations. So I would deal with the inequality more directly, and I would deal with the asset price speculation more directly, instead of trying to do it with interest rate policy. There's a reason, I think, why Keynes advocated permanent ZIRP, zero interest rate policy. Read chapter 24. The higher rates make it more difficult to find real projects that are about producing real stuff that can earn a return in a higher interest rate environment. So he advocated also it rewards the functionless investor, the rentier class. He wanted to euthanize the rentier class with a zero interest rate policy. So I think all of those arguments still hold up. And if it's true that the lower interest rates have been playing some role in the speculative fervor, we need to deal with the speculation directly.
Right, thank you. So would you say that this type of action on the financial sector should be an indispensable part of a Green New Deal? How wasteful are they in terms of resources? How much of the damage do they contribute to?
Well, a lot. So we have financialized everything, and that is a major source of the rising inequality, of the secular stagnation of the economy, the real part of the economy, of a cause of unemployment, downsizing the workforce. Wall Street is focused on financial markets, not on financing real production. All of these things are contributors to the multiple pandemics that we face. Financialization of pharmaceuticals makes it harder to respond to medical pandemics. So it's something that we should tackle as we're tackling all of these pandemics. Now, but if the question is how likely are we to do that, with a Biden administration and the Congress that we have, not too likely. We had a chance in 2008, 2009 to downsize finance. It would have required doing something like what Roosevelt did the last time we had a complete collapse of the financial sector. You take advantage of the collapse and you downsize finance. This time we didn't do it. We just propped them back up and sent them on their way to continue doing what they were doing. And they did. In fact, they have far surpassed what they did to bring on the last global financial crisis. The Fed, when the pandemic hit, the Fed, in addition to the things we've been talking about, the relief packages, the Fed again had to prop up the financial system. It may be, I mean, some people who work in markets have told me that they thought there was a real possibility the whole thing could have crashed again. But again, the Fed came to the rescue. So, once you have rescued them, you cannot reform them. They are politically too powerful. So I think realistically, we're not going to do a lot about financialization until the next financial collapse. It would be nice if we could, but politically, it's very difficult. And I'm an economist, and they are not very good at making political predictions, but it looks very, very tough.
Thank you. And I believe is the last question. So in your talk, you spoke about politicians' predisposition, a fear of the politicians' predisposition to spend too much, and that economists were fearful that they would know the truth about the capacities of government spending, or that the public might know them, because otherwise they may just spend too much, cause inflation in an effort, I guess, to buy votes, right, to entice voters. But we've seen the opposite. We've seen at least the last 3 decades that there seems to be a predisposition to spend too little and towards austerity. Would you agree with this, that there is that predisposition to spend too little, and what would you do about it?
Yeah, okay, first, inflation is politically unpopular, and politicians know that. So I think the idea that if they understood they couldn't run out of money, they would run out and try to cause high inflation is crazy. They will not do that. They are afraid of inflation. They're afraid the voters will punish them if inflation picks up. So I don't really think that's legitimate. Have they been biased the other direction? Yes, they have. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. One is that they bought the story that, we could become Zimbabwe if we don't keep spending down, burdening our grandkids, all that stuff. I think a substantial proportion really believe it. But then also, especially in the United States, we do have a very strong bias among a large percent of the people in Congress against social spending, a very strong bias against that. And it has to do with U.S. exceptionalism in a bad way, which is the fear that spending is going to help African Americans. I think it's racism plays a huge role in this. So we have a big bias against social spending that would benefit African Americans. So I think that is part of it. Now, I'm not trying to say everyone against welfare is racist, but it's a substantial proportion, and that is why we have such a weak safety net, and why Biden has a physical infrastructure and human infrastructure parts to his plan. The physical one has a much higher probability of getting through. The other one is going to be very difficult, and I think it reflects this bias. So, a lot of times you say it's a small government bias. It's not really. It's not that Republicans really truly want a small government. They just don't want a government that is doing social welfare type of things. Okay, they're perfectly happy with a big government as long as it's for military spending, but they don't want a big government that is providing child care and health care and free college kinds of things.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we've run out of time, so we will close the session. But thank you, everybody, for your questions. And thank you again, Professor Wray, for a really enlightening session.
Okay, thanks.
And just to remind everybody, tomorrow we're going to have panels on unions and demand policy at 9:15, and a second panel on inequality at 11:15. These are Berlin times, so you'll have to adjust it to wherever you are, I guess. And then the third panel is at 2 p.m. Berlin time on the Green New Deal. And the fourth panel is on political economy of fiscal policy at 4:15 Berlin time again. So I guess I'll see you tomorrow, and thank you for tuning in.